You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and the writer Benedict Spencer. They'll be with us from now right up until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Times speaks to the Chief Executive of NHS England, Amanda Pritchard, who insists a greater emphasis needs to be placed on training British-born doctors and nurses rather than relying on foreign labour. The Eye has an interview with the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, who says the NHS often puts the needs of its doctors over those of its patients. The Financial Times carries newly released figures which appear to contradict forecasts of an upcoming recession by many experts, including at the Bank of England. The Mail leads with the tragedy of the dog walker in Surrey, who died after she was attacked by the very animals she was walking. The Telegraph has its own sit-down with Prince Harry, who tells their royal editor he has enough material for another book, but held back to spare his brother and father's feelings. The Express has seen research suggesting hormone replacement therapy drugs could be useful in treating dementia patients. That's also the lead story for The Guardian. The Star reflects on the untimely death of the singer Lisa Marie Presley, who was, of course, the daughter of Elvis. And The Mirror marks her passing as well. While The Sun brings us news that Oasis singer-songwriter Noel Gallagher is getting a divorce from his second wife. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Jenny Kleeman and Benedict Spencer. Good evening to both of you. Let's start with the Times newspaper and the NHS head, Amanda Pritchard. She's calling for more doctors to be British-born rather than using foreign medics. So what do you think of this, Jenny?
Well, Amanda Pritchard is saying there's this over-reliance on foreign staff, £3 billion a year spent on agency staff. And she says apparently that the answer is for us to admit more doctors to medical schools, more medical students to medical schools. Apparently, medical schools only accept 16% of applicants. And I would say I want us to be pretty selective about who we admit to medical school. The issue isn't that there aren't enough doctors being trained in this country. The problem we have in the NHS is retention. Almost the same number of doctors who are trained each year, I saw some figures last week, almost the same number of doctors who are trained every year leave to go and work in other countries where they can be paid more or work easier hours. And of course, Amanda Pritchard isn't necessarily going to say that. She's chief executive of NHS England. So it's her way of solving the problem, according to this coverage in the Times, is for medical schools to offer more places to people.
Benedict, do you think Jenny's right and the real problem is one of retention rather than not having the available medics?
I do think that that's part of the problem. You only need to listen to the current medical staff who are going on strike, who are saying that actually the paying conditions aren't actually good enough to keep many of them in the job. But I do think that there is something to be said in training more medics. I don't think that what we're saying, if we decide to train more medics domestically, is that we're going to let in any old, all and sundry, anybody who wants to become a medic can just automatically become a medic. I don't think that it's going to be that so much. I think that it's right that a lot of very talented people don't make the courses every year. I also think that it's right that Britain needs to wean itself off importing medics from abroad, often from second and third world countries where their paying conditions are even worse than they are here. And that's why we go after them in many cases. I think that there's a profound sort of immorality actually about that, about taking medics from other countries that other countries have paid to train and bringing them over here. At the very least, I suppose, if you were training more people up here, and some of them were then going to other countries where they were better paid, that might balance out that shift to a degree. But I do agree that the overarching point here is about conditions in the NHS. But I certainly think that conditions in the NHS are going to be alleviated by having more doctors and nurses, and that will mean training more domestically, whether or not that means paying them more.
Just looking at some of the detail, I'm sure people will be surprised at the amount that's paid for agency staff. Health Trust paid up to £2,500 last year for a single agency nurse shift and up to £5,200 for a doctor shift. And the article goes on that about half of new doctors, nurses and midwives registered in the UK receive their training overseas. It's costing an awful lot to use agency staff, isn't it, Jenny?
It is, and it's a scandal. We have such enormous problems with the NHS anyway. I guess the issue is that it costs a lot to train people in British medical schools as well, and we really need to look at why so many are leaving. I think the answer is not necessarily It's easy for the chief executive of NHS England to say medical schools need to train more staff, because that is a cost that the NHS doesn't necessarily have to bear. That's the cost of medical schools, or people who are paying towards their own education. The real issue is, why are so many people who qualify as doctors leaving? And I like the fact that we're selective in this country. It's totally right that we shouldn't be spending money on overseas doctors. It's totally right that we shouldn't be robbing other countries of their brightest and best simply because we can pay them a salary that they couldn't make in their own country. But it has to start at home, of looking at the figures of why do so many doctors leave the profession.
Just to say that the chief executive of NHS England is stressing, quoted here, saying we will always welcome staff wherever they come from. Let's move on to the eye, and this is comment from Wes Streeting saying that the NHS is too often run for doctors and not for the patients that they serve, Benedict.
Yes, which I think potentially seems a little bit harsh in some cases, given that so many medics are leaving because the conditions in the NHS aren't good enough for them. I think possibly this refers mainly to GPs. And I mean, a lot of people, especially in rural areas, will know the difficulties in getting GPs appointments. And Wes Streeting talks actually in this interview with the Eye about ending that sort of rush that you get at 8 or 9 a.m. when your GP surgery opens and all of the appointments are gone. And it basically becomes a service for people who are, not in work that day. Those are the only people that can get appointments because they're the only people that can travel. So there is that aspect of the NHS I certainly think does need to be tackled. But again, in order to do that, that will require having more staff available, more staff on hand. And I think that this is very interesting because it's a Labour shadow health minister talking about basically he's approaching the idea of reform in the NHS, the idea that there needs to be a mentality away from staff towards patients. And that's curious because, of course, everybody talks about the NHS being this sort of sacred cow that can't be touched, and all that needs to happen is more money is pumped into it. And it's often caricatured that Labour is sort of more in favour of keeping the NHS as it currently is than the Tories. But this is, as I say, a Labour shadow minister coming out and saying there needs to be some sort of fundamental change. And I think it comes as part of a recognition that even if you throw lots of money at the NHS, even if you try to streamline it, even if you try to improve it, it has reached a point now, with all of the crises that we see, with all of the strikes that we see, where it is no longer acceptable for anybody to sit there and go, this is fine. No, this is very clearly a system that is creaking, that is breaking down. And it must also be said, as the demographics of this country shift and people get older and stay alive a lot longer, and the population ages in general and fewer people are being born, this is going to continue to be a burden. And we are going to have to find a more sustainable way of funding and staffing the NHS, because the current model isn't working now, and it certainly isn't going to be working in 5-10 years' time.
Well, specifically, Wes Streeting is promising to end the 8 a.m. scramble for GP appointments and to boost pharmacies. But he's also saying that the reforms will take at least a decade.
I find this line about ending the 8 a.m. scramble really interesting. Keir Starmer was using it in Prime Minister's questions this week as well. It's clearly something that the Labour Party has decided this is one of their lines. And it's a good one, because we've all had that feeling where we've woken up with terrible tonsillitis, or we've got a child who's really sick, and knowing that you have to keep redialing and being on hold, and that you might not get that emergency appointment that you need. It's not a nice feeling. And so definitely Labour wanting to appear to be on the side of patients rather than necessarily even the doctors in all of this. But Benedict's right. I mean, we have an ageing population here. We haven't solved the social care crisis. It's not even the case that spending needs to be at a constant level. It needs to be massively increased over the number of years, because the older the population gets, the more sick people there will be. So we need some kind of radical reform, and I think 10 years makes sense. It's the right kind of ballpark figure.
To the Financial Times, and a little bit of good news, a very little bit of good news, 0.1% to be precise, but still positive. Benedict.
Yes, some brightness amongst all of the gloom, although I suppose it does need to be tempered, as you say, only 0.1% growth in GDP, whereas it had been forecast to decrease by 0.2, but also accompanied by the chief executive of the Blackstone private equity group saying that, in his opinion, the UK was being a little undersold, that people were perhaps a little bit too gloomy about its economic forecasts. So, you know, we are talking, aren't we, generally about the sort of the negative state of the economy and the lack of productivity and a lost decade of growth compared to other G8 countries, G7 countries. Sorry, but you know, the FT talks about Jonathan Gray, the Blackstone CEO, who is a big player in the industry, saying that the Sunak administration, in his words, is putting forward policies that appear to be working, and he doesn't say that they're necessarily that Rishi Sunak is some sort of economic genius or anything like that. Far from it. But what he is saying is that the UK is actually performing pretty well compared to its competitors, say in the United States, in North America, in Europe, in the Far East. That's what we're sort of talking about here, because it is a global economic slowdown that we're talking about here. Now, specifically, the FT pays lip service to the World Cup, which is nice to know that even though we didn't do particularly well, it brought us some very mild respite in the short term. But of course, that is only a temporary blip, and it is still expected that the UK will enter a recession next year, that there will be that slowdown. So, as you say, some bright news, but let's not get the bunting out just yet.
Yes, quite. And Jonathan Gray saying in that article that, as you say, recession is delayed, not cancelled. So we still very likely to go into recession this year, Jenny.
Yes, I think that's very much what analysts are saying, although analysts were saying that there was going to be a contraction of the economy by 0.2%. It's good to hear that bad predictions can be wrong. But the thing about this good news is, does it really make any difference if we're not feeling it? I mean, living standards are falling at the fastest rate for 40 years, recession or not. We feel the incredible cost of living every time we go to the supermarket. We don't feel like we're bouncing back, even if it looks like the economy isn't as bad as we thought it might be. So the gains, whatever gains there may be, are not being passed down to households, and it does feel like a delayed recession. I mean, there's also, the potential good news on the horizon about wholesale gas prices falling, and maybe our gas bills aren't going to be as high as expected, but they're still going to be double what they were 4 years ago. So it's a little bit of good news, but even the Financial Times says itself that the signs of growth lighten the gloom and make the rate rise more likely. So I guess it's good news if you've got savings, you can make more interest on your savings. But if you've got a mortgage, then maybe this is even worse news, because if the economy can handle it, the Bank of England will increase interest rates a little bit more to try and tackle inflation. And that's going to be even more bad news if you've got a mortgage.
Benedict, potentially more good news in the Express for the treatment of dementia.
Yes, this is the news that, specifically for women, I think that this is the case, as that HRT treatment has been found potentially to have some positive effects when tackling dementia in elderly women, in helping to sort of halt the flow of it. And it's interesting, actually, I was reading another story yesterday about, I think it was a treatment for colds or coughs or something had been found to have some sort of positive impact in treating Parkinson's disease. And I'm not an expert in dementia or HRT for that matter, but it does seem to me that, very increasingly we hear these sorts of stories about the different uses of different treatments that have been sort of discovered for one thing and then can be applied for others. But it's these sort of terrifying diseases, things like dementia, that we are very slowly sort of finding solutions to. And amidst all the doom and gloom that we hear about the NHS, for example, and the pressures that are being applied onto it, we do need to remember the fundamental underlying reason why there is so much more pressure now on the NHS than there has ever been is because people are living longer, and because science is discovering more and increasingly sort of interesting and impressive ways of dealing with diseases that once upon a time we had absolutely no defense against. So it's again another little bit of bright news amongst all the gloom. And I tell you what, dementia is one of the worst things that one can possibly imagine. So anything in the fight against dementia, I think, is a positive.
Indeed. We'll talk a bit more about that in the 11 o'clock hour. But for the moment, Benedict and Jenny, thank you. We'll look back on the life and legacy of singer Lisa Marie Presley when we come back. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Jenny Kleeman and Benedict Spence. There they are, slightly delayed, but right on time. Let's have a look at the, a couple of papers, the Mirror and the Star, and both reporting on the untimely death of Lisa Marie Presley. Jenny.
I'm really, really saddened by this. That poor family, so many early deaths in the Presley family. And Priscilla Presley, Elvis Presley's ex-wife, Lisa Marie's mother, is still alive and has seen Lisa Marie Presley die so young, in her 50s. She also lost a grandson. Lisa Marie Presley lost her 27-year-old son 2 years ago to suicide. And you do think, how much pain can one family take, really? I mean, the Mirror here says that Lisa Marie died of a broken heart. It reveals some things that she said about living alongside the grief of her son's suicide, that it's not something, of course, that you ever get over. It's something that you learn to live with every waking day, but, you know, an enormous burden for her. And the poignancy that there are these images of her 2 nights ago at the Golden Globes, the appearances she gave, seeing Austin Talley win his award, and knowing that she was full of life 2 days ago, it makes it even more tragic. The Mirror has a really interesting detail in it that Elvis's mother died aged 46. We know that the cause of Lisa Marie Presley's death appears to be a cardiac arrest. Elvis Presley died of a heart attack. So, you know, we will find out in due course what the cause of her early death is. But for now, I just think it's extremely sad. Yes,
Benedict, sad is the only word, really, isn't it?
I think so. I thought that the Star's front page was perhaps a little not in the best taste, given the circumstances, but it's. I think Jenny's right. She sort of summed it up very well there. How much sort of torment can one family go through, and especially to have risen in the case of her father to sort of such heights, to the points where, you know, sort of even now in death, he sort of towers over aspects of the music industry, and it's a shadow that you can never really sort of get away from.
Indeed.
And of course, tied up in that is the misery of his later years. And I suppose actually in many ways, you know, we were talking about Lisa Marie at the Golden Globes, about for the film or about her father's life. It might, you know, it really did sort of bring home to a sort of a younger generation,
Benedict.
sort of the scale actually of what he went through.
Indeed. Benedict and Jenny, thank you so much. See you in the 11 hour.